my name is Helena Haag. I just use Lynn, as you can see in the brackets. I'm a registered social worker. I hold a Master's of Social Work, and I'm in the PhD program at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. I went back to school after a car crash in 2012, left me with a permanent brain injury. So, like many social workers, I come to the work that I live. So I bring that to my research and to the kind of work that I do. I try to blend my academic learning along with my lived experience. I do semi-practice when I have enough time in the doctoral program. And when I do, I work with adults with acquired brain injury. I leave pediatric stuff to other members of our team. And I generally work with people who are struggling to adjust to life after brain injury and disability. First today, we're going to talk a little bit just to make sure that we're on the same page. I tend to wander, so they're giving me the mic that moves. We're going to talk a little bit about sex and gender, because I know that for some of us, this is a familiar conversation, but for others it isn't. So first of all, sex typically refers to the biological and physical characteristics that distinguish males from females. And in the sort of the medical model, in the scientific model, this is the sort of the comfort zone for many of us, I know. Gender typically is referring to socially constructed roles, relationships, behavior, relative power, and other traits that societies ascribe to men and women. And you can see right away the language changes. So first we're talking about males and females, then we're talking about men and women. And that's usually a pretty good heads up. If I'm talking about gender, hopefully I'm talking about men and women. If I'm referring to sex, with luck, I'm talking about males and females. One of the things that's really interesting, although sex and gender are both commonly discussed as discrete and binary concepts, CIHR, which is the Canadian Institute of Health Research, is acknowledging that both are fluid. Not only fluid, they're interdependent and interconnected. And it's really important that we remember that, and that these relationships are complex. While most of my focus today is going to be talking about women and women's experience of brain injury, Dr. Colantonio will be speaking a little bit more about some of the comparisons that can be made between men and women and males and females. One of the things that stands out in the literature, historically, 70% of all of the literature, or all of the people experiencing brain injury have been men. That's a sort of a number that we've had for a long time, and it's commonly accepted. 30% then of reported cases of TBR are found in women. And I think the interesting word in this statement is reported. This is foreshadowing a little bit of where my work is going. I'll come back at the very end and talk to you about that, but I suspect that we have pockets of women who are currently underreporting, misdiagnosed, and we don't know about them. So while we have 70% of men in the literature, what that shows up as is very male-centric data, partially because we have more men to use as research participants, partially because we're interested in male data because that's the experience of most of our clients and most of our population, and partially because that's historically the way medical research has operated. Even going back to people working, I mean, if you think about people in labs in a traditional sense with little white mice, they're working with male mice. Hormones are considered pesky and they get in the way. So the easiest way to deal with that is to just work with mice that don't have them, and then apply the findings to women and everybody's good. Problem is, clearly there are problems with that. Research is beginning to show how significant those problems are, so we're moving into a gendered approach to healthcare research. 24% of girls and women will sustain a TBI before the age of 25. Personally, I find that to be an important number and rather startling. This is coming from a study done by McKinley and colleagues in New Zealand. Unfortunately, we don't have Canadian data at this point to compare to. One of the things that I think is really important about that 24% is putting a face on it. This is a woman who had, in May of this year, became news when she died after sustaining a brain injury in a rugby game. Part of what they're talking about in this conversation is that potentially previous injuries went unnoticed, undiagnosed, undetected, and so it was a cumulative effect. What would maybe have been one injury in one game became a tragic circumstance. So, and this is not horribly unusual. I mean, a death from an injury is, certainly. But we're hearing more and more about women in the news, brain injuries, sports injuries, all that kind of thing. So it's certainly a prevalent problem. Here at the Acquired Brain Injury Research Lab in the University of Toronto, we started noticing that this was certainly an issue, that we needed more information focused on women and women's experiences. And so we started to address this. It's been a main focus of the lab's work for about the last 9 years. And we're currently looking at a variety of topics, including the impact of ABI on reproductive and sexual health, violence and abuse issues, aging, psychological and emotional health, return to work and community integration, and the social and environmental factors necessary to achieve health and well-being. We found, I think one of the big overarching messages that we found is that it's really important to consider the interconnectedness. It's not a physical problem, it's not a social problem, it's an and both. And it's the interaction between the two that creates the experiences for the women and girls involved. It's a bit like a puzzle with a lot of pieces making up the whole, and we're only just beginning to start to see the picture. So this was the first project that I really became involved in the lab, and I was really excited to be a part of it. I came in as a doctoral student from Wilfrid Laurier, and I knew about Dr. Colantonio's reputation and wanted to figure out just how I could convince her that I was the next greatest thing and that she really needed to open the doors to the University of Toronto and to her lab here at UHN and bring me into the fold when I clearly don't quite belong. So I came knocking on her door and said, this is a great thing. I'm all about cross-disciplinary. I really believe in an interdisciplinary approach. I really want to come and talk to you. I know I have no idea how to count people, but I can talk to people, and that's what I do. Don't you want to get into qualitative research? And Dr. Colantonio had some data that she and the team had collected about 18 months, I think, earlier, where they'd sat down with a group of Canadian women and talked to them about their experiences of brain injury. And out of that, at this point, there hadn't really been somebody in the lab who was comfortable working with that data. And I said, that's great. This is exactly what I need to do. Give me 6 months and we'll get a paper out and you can decide I'm the best thing ever. So that sort of is what happened. I guess she decided it was certainly worth keeping me around. But we put out a paper called Being a Woman with Acquired Brain Injury, Challenges and Implications for Practice. One of the things that we discovered, just to give you a little bit of background, I suppose, we had 3 different categories of participant, and we triangulated the data. We talked to women who were survivors themselves, who were living with brain injury. We talked to caregivers, both an informal caregiver group, and we spoke with a formal caregiver group. And we took those results and triangulated the data to add some strength to what we were seeing in terms of the stories that were coming out. I know a lot of researchers want to know how many people said what. I don't tell you that, because in qualitative research, it's about the richness and the depth of the stories and what we heard. It's not about did 5 out of 6 people say it. So what we found is that women are facing really quite significant barriers to return to community post-injury. And we spoke to women who had a cross-section of severity of injury, as well represented quite a long time post-injury. So I think we had women who were as soon as sort of 2 years post-injury up to 20 or 25. So we did have quite a good cross-section that way. They were all white, they came from across Canada, but they were all English speaking. So I think we missed out on Quebec. We found that the social cultural values and expectations that are related to gender roles and responsibilities played a significant part in their experiences of brain injury. So what was what was expected of them as a woman. What did being a woman mean? What does it mean to them? What did it mean to their families, to their children, to their partners, to their work expectations and goals? And we found that there's insufficient rehabilitation and support focusing on return to work for those engaged in caring roles or other unpaid employment. Many of these women were, particularly the ones who were in a certain age category, little older in age, they were returning to unpaid employment in the home, in a homemaker position. And that's not what rehabilitation specialists do. They want to get you back into your job. They want to put you in a workforce. And if all you have to do is go home and make beds and cook dinner and clean the house, you can probably handle that brain injury or not. So there's a limited amount of support in those circumstances. Part of the challenge came around appearance, intimacy, and sexuality. This was a sort of an interesting topic. What are women supposed to do to be sexy? How are we supposed to dress? How are we supposed to behave? How are we socialized into these ideals and norms and approaches? And what we found was this was really challenging, particularly for the group, you might guess, at a lower age level. So our sort of the younger women participants really spoke about this and expressed frustration because one of the participants talked about how she couldn't put on her own makeup. She couldn't do up her own bra. And how was she supposed to be sexy when these kinds of things were challenges for her? And then difficulties re-engaging with family and household duties, coupled with a lack of care support. Who takes care of the carer? One of the things that I found particularly interesting came from the professional caregivers who said that what they notice in their practice is that women who come for support, for ABI support, don't have partners. Men who come for ABI support do, because women stick with their brain injured partners. Men, not so much. And so women with brain injuries are in positions where they're on their own. This is obviously a huge generalization, and all generalizations are false by nature, but what it does give us is a picture. It gives a researcher like me a place to sit and think, perhaps this is something that we need to explore further, we need to understand it, and it's a road that we need to go down. So that was where we got to with that study. There are pieces of it that are still being worked on, and that out of that developed another piece of work which I will come back and talk to you about in a minute. So which pieces of the puzzle next? What we've got to this point, I think, is that we know way less than we need to know. So one of the things that has happened for me working on that project really sort of, I think, solidified my interest in women's experiences of brain injury rather than just looking at TBI in general. And I started, we did a grant project a little while ago, and I came across a couple of articles that were reporting on very, very preliminary prevalence rates of potential TBI in women survivors of domestic violence. And once I had enough, I'd read enough to know that this was a problem, and I needed to put some more attention to it. And what I'm doing now, it's shifted the focus of my doctoral work. So I'm now looking at what I refer to as battered and brain injured. There are some things that we do know. And I want to start out by saying what we don't know is huge. I think we have about 12, 15, 20 studies done in the last 10 years in North America. We don't have any Canadian data at all. And what we have is extremely preliminary. We do know that interpersonal violence is the primary cause of injury to women between the ages of 15 and 44 in Canada. We know that 1 in 4 Canadian women will experience domestic violence over their lifetime. So if you think back to the 24% of women who are sustaining brain injuries before the age of 25, put that together with 1 in 4, 25% experiencing violence, starts to get to be a rather startling number. We also know that through work done earlier, previously by Dr. Colantonio, the violence-related TBI has poorer outcomes than non-violent. And we know that both violence, domestic violence survivors and people living with brain injury typically have higher rates of mental illness, substance use, unemployment, and poverty. So their experiences day to day are far more challenged than their uninjured counterparts. The really startling piece of information out of those 12 to 15 to 20 studies is that we suspect that 35 to 80% of women survivors of domestic violence have possible TBI. We don't know because nobody's asking. We don't have TBI diagnostic tools that are sensitive to a DV environment. So and it's not on the radar. This is something that social work, that as a social worker is really sort of high importance to me, because there's so many of my colleagues who are helping this population and working in these areas. And I know they don't know what they're talking about when it comes to TBI. So this is, I think what we need to do, this is a topic that needs to come out of TBI research. It's not going to come out of the domestic violence team. This is something that has to be pushed through from this angle first. So that's what I'm working on. We do know some things that put together I refer to as the perfect storm effect. So first of all, we know that the most likely type of violence is going to be hits to the head, face, and neck, including strangulation and asphyxiation. We know that those types of injury are the most likely types of injury to cause traumatic brain injury. And we know that those types of brain injuries caused by those types of violence are most likely to result in damage to the frontal lobe, to the executive functions, to the emotional stability, to the ability to organize, process information, to make plans. Is any of this starting to sound really kind of scary? What's happening is these women are being left vulnerable to continued violence, exponentially compounding the damage to the brain in an ongoing cycle. Their brains are compromised to the point, potentially, where they can no longer process information, keep track of what they need to, plan effectively, and remove themselves from a violent set of circumstances. And traditionally, up till now, our approach to this has been to stand back and blame women for not leaving violent homes. That's the way that we have approached this historically. So what are some of the key challenges? There's a silencing around domestic violence from one side of the spectrum to the other. There's a stigma that is attached, a shaming. So domestic violence is one of the conditions for women that goes across socioeconomic demographics, it's across racial demographics, it's across age. It can happen to any woman, anytime, anywhere. And the shame that goes along with that silences women. So they don't speak out, they don't seek help. They're often in a position where they can't do that. That goes across to the safety side. When asking for help puts them at risk for their lives, they stay silent, they remain silent. Threats to people that they care about keeps them silent. Those two together create an isolation. These women are often left alone in houses, in circumstances that they have no way out. There's nothing they can do. And then on top of that, you add a compromised brain that has difficulty processing information and retaining information, planning, organizing, identifying, all of those kinds of things. We also have a siloing effect. This is going on in the research world. All of these different areas of research have been looking at domestic violence for years. So brain injury research and support is definitely talking about brain injury. Domestic violence research and support, definitely talking about domestic violence, not talking to each other. We have social work, my field, Some social workers are beginning to get interested in TBI. It is happening. It's a long, slow process. Certainly when I got into social work 10 years ago, nobody knew what it was. Nursing is definitely talking about both conditions, not talking about them together. Primary health care, I just completed a CIHR-funded fellowship looking at primary health care in this particular aspect. I was interested in women survivors of violence who have brain injuries and their access to primary care. Barriers, facilitating factors, that kind of thing. So I can tell you that primary health care isn't talking about them together. And gender studies isn't looking at it either. Gender studies may be looking at issues of violence, but they're not talking about TBI. So we have all of these different groups looking at pieces of the puzzle, but nobody's talking to each other. I believe that what we need to do is start opening windows instead of building silos. We need more opportunities like this, where I have a lot of people in the room who come from a lot of different places who are here to listen to bits and pieces. It's one of the reasons, as Dr. Polantonio mentioned, that I'm sort of spreading the word where I can go a little bit, because I think it's really important that these numbers are too disturbing to me and we need to do something about it. I think there are ways to improve outcomes for women survivors of violence. First and foremost, we need more research. We need to understand the risk and protective factors. We need to understand the prevalence rates. We need to count. We need to understand the long-term health implications, social impact, support needs, and we need DV-appropriate TBI diagnostic tools, which is just far too many letters in one sentence. And that's really relevant because the experiences for women survivors of violence are quite different in many ways. And those experiences need to be recognized and assisted when in a situation where somebody's asking them questions. It needs to be safe, both physically and psychologically. And the tools that we have for diagnosing traumatic brain injury aren't sensitive to that kind of thing. We need communication between we need interdisciplinary teams. We need healthcare providers talking with first response teams. The most likely people to be in the position to talk to these women at any time are first response teams. We need those people understanding brain injury. We need them to understand what it looks like, what are the most likely signifiers for it. There are diagnostic tools out there that can be in the hands of any layperson. You need 15 minutes and a couple of questions, and it will give you an indication of likelihood. That's the first step. We need DV support providers who understand the language of TBI. They need to know what it looks like, what it walks like, what it talks like. How do I give it support? How do I treat? What do I do? So it's a conversation that has to take place in these circles. And I come back to these interdisciplinary teams. And I think it's important to note we need them on multi-levels. We need them in the community. We need them in provincial levels. We need them in federal levels and international. This is a problem that we have identified. Domestic violence is something that we've been talking about for years. This is a focus in a lot of countries for a lot of reasons. Now we need to start talking about brain injury within this community and how we can help these women. I'd like to thank the funders, always. So we have the Canadian Institute of Health Research, Ontario Neurotrauma, Toronto Rehab, the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, Brain Injury Association of Canada, and as Angela pointed out, the many, many students who've done work on this, staff, clinicians, volunteers, and particularly participants. These people allow us access, they share their stories, particularly in my case, they sit down and they talk to me and share stories, and they trust that we will do something worthwhile with their stories and their data and do something to improve their circumstances. So I think that's a very special thank you. And I think we're going to open the floor up for questions. So if anybody has anything they want to ask, go right ahead.
Thank you both for the presentation. I'm interested in what you think a diagnostic tools, particular to women who are living in violent circumstances, might look like, and how it would, and when it would best be administered given the particular circumstances of having an abusive partner generally on site, particularly when EMS providers arrive.
Absolutely, and I think that's part of what needs to come out of the conversation piece, is an understanding in the TBI research world of the singular challenges in domestic violence world, and how can we develop a tool that can address those concerns, because that's absolutely important. I think there are ways to ask questions. There are ways to remove someone from the presence of a suspected abusive partner, for starters. And I think a sensitivity to that in the domestic violence world is already going on. We have a lot of people in, I've come across people in circumstances where they are often first responders who become sensitive to small messages of discomfort in their partner, with a partner, and can be separated out, even if it's just for 2 or 3 minutes. Do they need the bathroom? Do they need, can we get them a drink of water? Can we assist with parking in some way just to get that physical separation? And then I think really quite basic questions will give you the start to information. Have you received, have you been having trouble with dizziness? Have you lost consciousness? Has there been a period when you're suffering from confusion? Are you having memory challenges? You don't want all of them, but just a few can give you the beginnings of, do I need to do more questions? Is this something that I need to follow up more? Mm-hmm.
So, just in your response, it seems to me that some of those are acute presentation basic questions, and others are longer term questions. And so we're actually talking about instruments perhaps at the paramedic EMS level, and then later a need to sensitize other healthcare providers.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that has occurred to me and to others, it's not just healthcare. Clergy, for instance, are often a place where women feel that they can disclose violent circumstances. So I think there's actually quite a broad spectrum. There are a lot of community-based organizations, peer support organizations, where women have traditionally come and to some degree have disclosed violent circumstances. And I think those places also need to be educated. There needs to be a sort of a handbook. What can we do? What kinds of questions can we ask? What should we be asking? And then what kinds of interventions are effective? And I think this is a multi-stage process, and we're at this much of a huge iceberg. But if we don't start, then we don't get anywhere. And one of the things that I think I really discovered was those sort of initial reports, those 15 papers, some of those are done by highly respected brain injury researchers who then just didn't follow up with it. They're 10 years old and they've moved on into other fields. They looked at these kinds of challenges and said, it's just too much, we can't do it, or the funding isn't there, the interest isn't there. It's a population that traditionally doesn't receive a lot of support. And I think it's going to take people who are dedicated in a variety of fields, and we just have to start the process and see where we go. One of the things that I'm working on right now is putting together a grant application. I'd like to get a group of 10, 15, 20 organizations here in Toronto at the table. I'd like to know what they know about brain injury. I'd like to talk to domestic violence support organizations about do they even know what brain injury is? Have they ever heard about it? Are they thinking about it in their own population? If they are, what are they doing about it? How do they recognize it? support for it, refer for it. If they don't, what can we do about that? So, and I mean, that is really exploratory research, and that really is the stage that we're at this point. It's really early days.
A couple of questions online here, and the first one I'll ask is sort of builds on the idea of the theme of domestic violence. For women who, women who are victims of domestic violence, how does one distinguish if they need to be treated for a traumatic brain injury, or if what they're experiencing is due more to the impact of being in an abusive relationship?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's part of the historical challenge, is that what does brain injury look like versus what does survivorship of violence look like, right? Trauma. So you've got brain injury and trauma, they look an awful lot alike. I mean, we've got PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder thrown in there, looks an awful lot like a traumatic brain injury. There are known differences, that diagnostic differences between them. They're very subtle, but they are known within the brain injury research community. So again, it's a message of, it's a need to get the message out. We need to educate people in the right position, how to identify, how to support, what can we do. And it's knowing those differences is really very subtle. What we're I think the thing that we're looking for first is the likelihood. So what are we most likely to be looking at in any one individual's experience? Once we've established that, then you can break them out into more detailed diagnostic, more specialized support, that kind of thing. But it really, I think in many ways, it's going to be a case-by-case situation, and it's going to need people on the ground. That first response team has to be educated about what they're looking for and how best to suspect that it's there.
Yeah, and that was a great response. But also, even we're at the stage of even asking the question, have you ever had a hit to the head? Yeah. I mean, it's not routinely done, or going through all the possible mechanisms. But the way you screen for brain injury is, have you ever had a fall? Have you ever had a car crash? Have you ever had this? If you just ask, have you ever had a bump to the head? It's not as effective in terms of prevalence than if you jog the memory in all these different scenarios. And the other thing with women, too, is we have the non-traumatic brain injury, which is asphyxiation. That occurs, too, like sort of an active brain damage. So we're at the stage of just even having that question being asked. The second question from online relates to PTSD, actually. Can you speak about the overlap in symptoms related to TBI and PTSD, as I said that correctly, and how we might distinguish and treat them? You touched on that.
And I suspect that's actually one of the reasons that we haven't been looking for this in this population, is because they've been hiding in a PTSD diagnosis. And I think that's particularly challenging both in a brain injury context and in a domestic violence context. They do look remarkably similar. 10 years of sort of reading and researching in this context, the piece of the puzzle that stands out the most to me is the flashbacks, the dramatic flashbacks. That is a piece of PTSD. It isn't necessarily a piece of brain injury. And it's one of the very few sort of diagnostic flags that people look for that shows up that is a sort of a key criteria of PTSD, and is not a key criteria. In fact, it's not even necessarily quite common in brain injury itself. But it's also really important to remember these are not discrete categories. Why would anybody suspect that someone who has survived a traumatic experience, particularly in the case of a survivor of domestic violence who's looking at trauma in a repeated context, why wouldn't they have PTSD? It doesn't mean that having PTSD doesn't mean you don't have a brain injury, and having a brain injury doesn't mean you don't have PTSD. It means you have twice as much
to cope with, is all. It isn't, we can support things differently, that's fine. We can have conversations, we can develop interventions, we can work with women for both and or either. We just need to know they're there. And I think part of the challenge is with brain injury is that if we only focus on the PTSD and we only assume that women have healthy brains that are capable of processing information in ways that we have decided to disseminate that information, that's when we're going to run into trouble. We need to have an understanding that what we're dealing with is more complicated, is more complex, and does require specialized care and specialized intervention.